In this environmental systems unit, we're going to discuss two things: systems and matter, and then energy flows and feedbacks. By the end of the systems and matter video, you should be able to describe how matter is comprised of atoms and molecules and how they move differently among systems, explain why water is an important component of most environmental systems, and thirdly, be able to discuss how matter is conserved in a chemical and a biological system. So I bet you're wondering, what do rocks, water, air, and the book that's in your hands, the iPad that's in your hands, the phone that's in your hands, and all of the cells in your body have in common? Well, they are all forms of matter. Matter is anything that occupies space and has mass. The mass of an object is a measurement of the amount of matter that is contained within it. And also note that the word mass and weight are often used interchangeably, but they are not the same thing. So weight is a force that's a result from action of gravity on mass. So your own weight, for example, is determined by the amount of gravity pulling you towards the planet's center. Whatever your weight on Earth is, you would weigh less if you were on the moon because the gravity of the moon is weaker. In contrast, mass stays the same under any sort of gravitational influence. So although your weight could change on the moon, your mass would remain the same because the amount of matter you are made up of would still be the same if I put you on Earth or if I sent you to the moon. So in this section, we're going to look at the important properties of matter, starting with its own building blocks. Taking you back to chemistry here, all matter is comprised of these tiny particles that cannot be broken down into any smaller parts or pieces, and we call those atoms. An atom is the basic building block of matter. An element is a substance composed of atoms that cannot be broken down into any smaller components. And an element contains chemical properties of that particular atom. At Earth's surface and temperatures, elements can occur as solids, liquids, and even gases. And they are so small that a single human hair measures about a few 100,000 carbon atoms just all the way across it. So 94 elements occur naturally on Earth, and another 24 have been produced in laboratories. The periodic table is a list of all the elements currently known throughout an organization, and they're also organized by their properties. To do a little chemistry review, we talked about the periodic table. Now let's differ between an atom, an element, and a molecule. So a molecule is a particle that contains more than one atom. Oftentimes chemists refer to a molecule or molecular as something that is about a living system. But in general, the term just basically means it's more than one atom stuck together. It's also probably the most misused vocabulary word for biologists. So symbols on the periodic table are used to describe the makeup of molecules, particles that contain more than one atom. And molecules that contain more than one element, we often describe as compounds. So for example, carbon dioxide, CO2, is a compound composed of one carbon atom and two oxygen atoms. So there it goes, CO2. All right, the total numbers of protons and neutrons in an element is known as its mass number. And because the mass number of electrons is pretty much insignificant compared to how much a proton and a neutron weighs, oftentimes we do not include electrons in the mass number calculations. So the periodic table lists the mass number of each element directly under its name. So although the number of protons in a chemical element is consistent, atoms of the same element may differ as far as the number of neutrons are concerned, and therefore that often changes its mass. So atoms that are the same element, meaning they have the same proton number, but they have different numbers of neutrons, are called isotopes. Isotopes of the element carbon, for example, have 6 protons, but they can occur with 6, 7, 8 neutrons, which yield mass numbers to 12, 13, 14. And so in nature, carbon occurs as a mixture of these carbon isotopes. And all carbon isotopes behave chemically initially the same. But the biological processes which are used, which use up carbon, sometimes favor one isotope over the other. And so certain what we call isotropic or esoteric signatures or ratios of these isotopes can be left behind by different biological processes. And environmental scientists love to find these signatures and learn all certain things about them. And they learn how to evaluate environmental conditions like air pollution based on the measurement of these isotropic signatures. It's not just carbon that leads an isotopic signature. Many elements do. Modern carbon inside of like wood and fossils and oils or even coal on the planet, they all have a different isotope signature. The portions of the different isotopes in polluted air can basically tell us where that pollution came from, whether it was like a forest fire or the combustion of a fossil fuel or the burning of oil. And so environmental scientists love to get readings from air, and that's how they can basically determine if the pollution in the air was from burning of fossil fuels, or if it's smog from cars, or if it is just a forest fire that's happening in the state away. When you look at all of the isotopes of any certain element, the nuclei inside of that atom can be stable or it can be unstable. It depends on the mass number of that isotope and if the neutrons and the proton number that it contains, if the nucleus can hold a stability. So an unstable isotopes are radioactive. Radioactive isotopes undergo what we call radioactive decay, and that's a spontaneous release of material from their nucleus. Radioactive decay changes the element's identity. So uranium-235, when it's inside of a nuclear power plant and it's submitted to nuclear decay, it turns into thorium, which is element 231, or its mass number of 231. So the radioactive decay of uranium-235 and certain other elements emit a great deal of energy that can be captured as heat. And a nuclear power plant uses this heat to produce steam, which turns turbines to generate electricity. We measure this radioactive decay process by recording the average rate of decay of a quantity of radioactive elements. So the measurement is commonly stated in terms of a half-life of an element, which is the time it takes for 1/2 of the original radioactive product to decay in half. So an element's half-life is a useful parameter to know because some elements that undergo radioactive decay emit like very harmful radiation. And the knowledge of this half-life allows scientists to determine the length of time that a particular radioactive element may be dangerous. So, for example, using the half-life shows scientists to calculate the period of time that people and the environment must be protected from depleted nuclear fuel, or like that could be generated from a nuclear power plant or a nuclear power plant explosion. And so, as it turns out, many of the elements that are formed during this decay process of uranium-235 in a nuclear power plant have these tens of thousands of years of half-life. So this poison that is created, or this toxin that is created, is definitely not going to decay and evolve into something safe in our lifetime. So from this reason, we see a lot of long-term storage of radioactive nuclear decay products, and that becomes really important in nuclear energy. And we actually have a unit on that, and we'll discuss that later. All right, covalent bonds. Elements that do not readily gain or lose electrons, they like to share electrons. Those are what we call a covalent bond. And those compounds are formed by sharing of electrons, and they're held together. And the illustration is up here next. There are 3 types of chemical bonds: covalent bonds, ionic bonds, and hydrogen bonds. So if you remember from chemistry, Essentially, chemical bonds fall into three different categories. They're known as covalent bonds, ionic bonds, or hydrogen bonding, at least to biologists anyway. So, elements that do not readily like to lose or gain electrons like to form these sharing electron bonds. To refresh your memory here on an ionic bond, that's a chemical bond between two ions that are oppositely charged. And oftentimes it is between a metal and a non-metal. So if you look here at this diagram, you see a sodium atom and a chlorine atom. The sodium atom transfers and loses one electron, and the chlorine atom gains that. That transfers is what has created this ionic bond. In an ionic bond, when this transference happens, one atom becomes electron deficient, it becomes positively charged, and the other one becomes electron rich to become negatively charged. And that charged atoms, which were called ions, the charge imbalance holds the two atom structures together. And the attraction between those opposing positive and negative charges form that chemical ionic bond. An ionic bond is not usually as strong as a covalent bond, and so for that it means that the compounds can readily dissolve in water. They just dissolve, dissociate is what we call it. They come apart in water. So, for example, sodium chloride remains in a salt shaker, but as soon as you put it into water, you no longer see the salt. The salt has come apart into its sodium positive 1 ion and its chlorine negative 1 ion. The third type of bond I want to talk about is a hydrogen bond. And a hydrogen bond is a weak chemical bond that forms when hydrogen atoms are covalently bonded to one atom and attracted to the atom on another molecule. So when the atoms of different elements form these bonds, their electrons may be shared unequally. That unequal sharing pulls them closer to one atom in particular. And in some cases, the strong attraction of that hydrogen electron to the other atoms creates this imbalance within this covalently bonded molecule. We see this in water, essentially. Each water molecule itself, as a whole, is actually neutral. And that is that it carries neither a positive or a negative charge. But water has an unequal covalent bond between these two hydrogen atoms that are hanging off this oxygen atom. Because of these unequal bonds that the H2O bonds contain, water is considered what we call polar. And in a polar molecule, one side is more positive and the other side is more negative. And we can see that as a result here in the next figure. Here we have water and its polarity demonstrated, where you can see that the partially positive charged hydrogens on one side and the partially negative charged oxygen on the other create an imbalance in this charge, which create poles. When water is sitting in a container, you can see how the partial positive charge on the hydrogen of one atom is attracted to the partial negative charge of the oxygen on another atom, because water molecules they're sitting in a container. All right, so then they tend to align themselves directly with this attractive force. And so we see this hydrogens interacting, we call those hydrogen bonds. To a biologist, hydrogen bonds, they're everything. They occur in nucleic acids, like DNA, the biological material that carries all of our genetic code. They occur in every living thing. Because water is oftentimes the vehicle for transferring chemical elements and compounds from one system to another, or they're vital to every stage of metabolism in life, environmental scientists really need to understand how water actually behaves. How it behaves on a molecular level, how it behaves on a hydrogen bonding level, and how it behaves as a pool, as a large component itself. So the molecular structure of water has all these unique properties that support conditions that are necessary for this variety of life on Earth. And it's truly amazing. You can get college degrees in just one molecule, in just water. One of the most fascinating things that environmental scientists love to study, along with this chemistry component is surface tension.